Week 6 of the NFL season is in the books, and we are heading straight into Week 7. And you know what we need to do. We need to go through every single matchup, every single player at the running back position. We got injuries, we got excitement, we've got disappointment, we've got 2 NFL bye weeks here in Week 7. So we need to be talking about who you should be starting and who you should be sitting at the running back position as we approach Week 7. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 7 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free Bo Nix over half of a total yard to use towards Thursday night football. And don't worry, if you guys watch this video later in the week, you're still going to get a free pick'em to use towards Sunday's action. And on top of that, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. Very quickly, we have 2 teams on bye week here in Week 7. The Bears will be on bye, so we'll be without DeAndre Swift as well as Roschon Johnson. The Cowboys will be on bye week, so no Rico Dowdle this week and no crusty dusty Zeke. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick things off with Thursday night football. We'll have the Broncos traveling to face the Saints. And boy, oh boy, this just feels like a gross matchup. And I am not trusting the Broncos running backs whatsoever. They've had, 1 or 2 good matchups here. Javonte was able to muster up something against the Jets in Week 4, and then a good matchup against the Raiders in Week 5, where Javonte and Jaleel McLaughlin both had 10 or more fantasy points, but I just don't trust them against the Saints. I mean, sure, maybe Javonte gets enough receiving work that he gets you double digits, or McLaughlin finds a way to score, or whatever. I'm just not trusting either of these guys. They just feel way too stale. Short week, good defense against the Saints. I just want nothing to do with them. Audric Estime came back from a brief stint on IR. 1.3 fantasy points in Week 6. Just no thank you. I'm staying away from the Broncos running backs on a short week against the Saints. Now, on the other hand, Alvin Kamara is a must-start player on a weekly basis. At the time I'm recording this, he is the RB2. In fantasy football, he is double digits every single week so far on the season. 17.4 fantasy points in Week 6, 40 yards on the ground, and a touchdown, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 24 receiving yards. No reason to ever bench Alvin Kamara, even on a short week, against a good Broncos run defense. We're still starting Kamara. Now, Jamal Williams is nothing more than a handcuff. 0.7 fantasy points in Week 6, 2 touches. So nothing more than a handcuff. I'm straying away from the Broncos running backs. I want nothing to do with them. And Alvin Kamara, weekly must-start player. Will bring us to Sunday's first game. It's going to be the last London game of the year, and that'll be between the Patriots and the Jaguars. So what do we do with this Patriots backfield, as Ramondre Stevenson missed Week 6 against the Houston Texans, and Antonio Gibson had just 7.3 fantasy points as the starting running back. We saw very brief involvement out of Jermichael Hasty as well as rookie Terrell Jennings. They're just kind of in that category. I think Stevenson will probably be good to go in Week 7, dealing with that foot injury. The thing that we can't ignore here is that they're playing the Jaguars, and this run defense is absolutely atrocious, as well as the entire defense. So a little bit of light with Drake May at quarterback. I would expect that the Patriots are going to be able to put up some points against the Jaguars. So if Stevenson plays, maybe he gets a little bit of a downgrade the way things have gone the last couple of weeks. But Stevenson still had 19 fantasy points in Week 5 against the Dolphins, and their run defense arguably just as bad as the Jaguars. So if he plays, I think he's definitely in the start area, but it just feels kind of iffy right now with this backfield. Gibson, remains in the area, but it's really dependent on Stevenson's health. You know, once again, he's only in that area because of the matchup against the Jaguars. But he had a great matchup in Week 5, and Stevenson was supposed to be benched, and he wasn't, and then Gibson did nothing. And the Texans top 10 against running backs on the season in terms of fantasy points allowed. Gibson did next to nothing against him, just 7.3 fantasy points. But it's the Jaguars, so don't be surprised if you own either of these guys that they have good weeks. I do think if Stevenson plays, we probably want to try and start him, but we'll have to see if he even plays at all here in Week 7. All right, moving along to the Jaguars. Tank Bigsby's in the category. I don't think you have to go out of your way to start Bigsby. A very bad game script for the Jaguars in Week 6 really hurt Bigsby. 7 touches, 24 rushing yards, 2.4 fantasy points after the massive performance against the Colts in Week 5. So I will say I like Bigsby this week against the Jaguars, but it's really going to depend on, against the Patriots, but it's really going to depend on what you have at the running back position. And then we also have an injury to Travis Etienne. So if Etienne does not play in Week 7, which he essentially didn't play in Week 6, just 3 touches and got hurt and everything. So if we see no Etienne, then I do like Bigsby more. The Patriots' run defense has been pretty soft so far on the year. So it's kind of monitor things here. I think Bigsby's definitely startable, but it can be easy to chase points. He had a great day against the Colts. The game script got out of hand. Tougher matchup against the Bears, who actually the Bears haven't been that good against running backs. It's just a bad game script. So I like Bigsby, but going to be a little bit careful because we also saw 6 touches and 2 targets to Dearness Johnson in Week 6. So listen, no need to panic if you picked up Tank Bigsby and you're thinking you can rely on him. I think he's still going to be solid, but I don't know, something about this matchup, Stevenson, Bigsby, I just feel a little bit off here. We'll see what happens. Let me know how you guys feel in the comments down below. All right, moving into Sunday's afternoon games, we're going to have the Lions traveling to face the Vikings in what should be a good overall matchup. And let's start with the Lions running backs, who are both must-starts on a weekly basis on the road here. Tough matchup, as the Vikings have been very good against the run. But come on, there's no way we're benching Monty. 15 or more fantasy points every game of the season. Jahmyr Gibbs has also been great. 12 or more fantasy points every game on the season. Monty has been the better fantasy running back so far on the year. The way they're utilizing him, he is just the heartbeat of this Lions offense. But yeah, it's a tough matchup. Good divisional game here. Both of these teams are going to try and do whatever they can to get a dub. 2 of the best teams in the NFL right now, Monty and Gibbs, no questions asked, are must-start players. Now, Aaron Jones is dealing with that hip injury. He's considered week to week. If he plays, I think you can start him. The Lions have been very good against the run, but once again, good game script, divisional game, all that stuff. Jones, for the most part on the season, has been very solid. So if he's healthy, I do like him. Now, Ty Chandler, I think, is just kind of in that category, and he's only startable if Aaron Jones does not play. But even then, it's not a great matchup. He's going to have much better opportunities potentially against the Rams, Colts, and Jaguars in weeks 8, 9, and 10 if he is truly the starter. So this is all dependent on Aaron Jones' health. If you're desperate for points, sure, Chandler's an option, but I just don't really like this matchup for Ty Chandler, Jones, on the other hand, been much better on the season, so he is startable if healthy. All right, next up we have the Titans traveling to face the Bills. This one should definitely be interesting, and we have some names to go over here for sure. So Tony Pollard's been solid all year long. Bad game in week 3. Outside of that, 15 or more fantasy points in every matchup. He's had a lot of good matchups against weak run defenses, but this passing attack for the Titans is just non-existent, and Pollard has had 16 or more touches in 3 out of 5 starts on the season. So the Titans were out in week 5 on their bye week, but Pollard's a solid start. It's a great matchup against this Bills run defense has been very poor on the season. Now, as a reminder, I have to record these early on Monday, so I don't know how the Bills have looked on Monday Night Football, but either way, this should be a very good matchup for Pollard, and I would dare say he's a must-start player. Tajay Spears, a little banged up in Week 6 with a hamstring injury, has been deemed week to week. So if he plays, I think he's just in that category because of the matchup. The only other running back at the time of recording this that's active is Julius Chestnut. I don't think we're starting him, but Pollard should be a very solid start this week. Now, once again, I'm recording this before Monday Night Football. James Cook is questionable for Monday Night Football. So I do think James Cook is in that caliber of like, you own him, you just start him if he plays. 13 or more fantasy points every game of the year except for Week 4 against Baltimore. So Cook, if he's healthy, he plays, you start him. Ray Davis, Ty Johnson, they are fully contingent on if Cook is not healthy or re-aggravates the injury on Monday Night Football or something. Don't have any interest in starting either of those guys if James Cook is healthy. They're just kind of a committee handcuff running back situation. So as long as everyone's healthy here, we should have two solid starts in Tony Pollard and James Cook in this matchup. All right, next up we have the Dolphins traveling to face the Colts, and this is definitely a headache of a matchup at the running back position, but we have two very soft run defenses here. So let's just start with Devon Achane, who had suffered a concussion in Week 5. At the time of recording this, he has practiced with a red non-contact jersey. So if Achane plays, I think we start him. It's a good matchup. I know this offense is limited right now, but it is a good matchup. So I like Achane enough this week if he's healthy and does play. If he does not play, then I think Raheem Mostert or Jalen Wright are kind of in that of a okay category. Mostert had 11.8 fantasy points in Week 5. Jalen Wright had 8.6. So neither of them had a touchdown. That might change against the Colts. And we still have some other names like Jeff Wilson, who's been injured, and Alec Ingold, who I guess Ingold's a fullback. But I don't know. My thesis so far on the year has been, if Achane's healthy, you start him. If he's not healthy, I'm just staying away from this mess for the Dolphins. So Achane's out there. Yeah, I'm good with it. The matchup's good enough. If you're desperate for points and Achane does not play, Mostert or Wright will probably get you some points in this matchup. All right, moving along to the Colts, and sorry, Jonathan Taylor should have had an asterisk next to his name this whole time because he's still dealing with that ankle injury. And we don't know if he's going to play in Week 7 or not. I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. I think there's a good chance he does not play. But if he does play, it's a great matchup against the Dolphins. His run defense has been very poor on the season. So, yes, JT, if you own him, you'll probably be starting him regardless of the matchup. But we're going to have to wait and see what's going on with the ankle injury. So that brings us to Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson. Sermon, 18 fantasy points in Week 5. Goodson, 8 fantasy points. In Week 6, 2.9 for Sermon, 10.5 for Goodson. So definitely a bit of a committee here. And this is a great Colts offensive line. And Sermon had 18 touches last week. A tougher, run defense in Tennessee, but 1.61 yards per carry. I mean, I know it's a backup running back, but that's not what we want to see. Where Goodson at 6.38 yards per carry. So due to the matchup, a very, very bad Dolphins run defense at home here, I do think that Sermon or Goodson are startable. But, Sermon had 6 catches in Week 5 and a touchdown, 3.8 yards per carry. Like, he wasn't very good, and that was against the Jaguars. He just made the most out of getting actual receptions from 6 targets and then scored a touchdown late in that game. So I do kind of worry about him. I know he's been a popular waiver ad. I still think he has value here because of the matchup if JT doesn't play, but let's maybe not go out of our way to start Sermon. And the same goes for Goodson, who hasn't been, he's 9% rostered compared to Sermon's 63% rostered. So it's a good matchup. It's dependent on JT's health, but yeah, we got a big headache at this point in the week when we're looking at this matchup for running backs between the Dolphins and the Colts. And next up, we have the Seahawks traveling to face the Falcons. We got 2 stud running backs and 2 good handcuff running backs here. So Let's start with the Hawks. Not the best, not the worst matchup against the Falcons, and vice versa for the Falcons versus the Hawks. And I'm expecting points in this game and a good game script. That's just my guess. The Seahawks defense has just allowed for a lot of good game scripts, and the Falcons, well, they're a little bit stiffer in week 6, allowed for a lot of points in week 5. So Walker is a must start if you own him every single week. 14 or more fantasy points every game on the season that he's been healthy and played in, with a ceiling of 33.6 fantasy points. You own Walker, you start him. Now, Charbonnet's volume has definitely came back to earth in the last 2 weeks, and he's a great handcuff. Filled in very nicely in weeks 2 and 3 for Kenneth Walker, but just not enough here the past 2 weeks. 4.5 and 6 fantasy points. He always has a chance to score, can get involved in the receiving game, but at the end of the day, this is Kenneth Walker's backfield, so he's going to be a sit, but certainly still a valuable handcuff. And then when we look at the Falcons running backs, I know Bijan has been frustrating. He's my must-start player in week 6. I think a lot of people echoed that agreement going up against the Panthers, and a lot of people liked Algier as well going up against the Panthers because that run defense is just the worst in the NFL. Both had double digits last week. 19.8 for Algier, 105 yards on the ground, and a touchdown for Algier. 95 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns for Bijan Robinson with 25.5 fantasy points. So I know some people might look at Algier this week and get tempted, but it's just not going to be the same this week against the Seahawks, who have had their own struggles with injuries up front and against the run and everything, but they're not the Panthers. Algier is just a handcuff this week. You'd have to be really desperate. I mean, same goes for Charbonnet. If you need some points, like you're really desperate in a deep league, Algier or Charbonnet will probably get you some points, but I'm not starting Algier this week. He's a sit, and Bijan is a start on a weekly basis. A little bit of a frustrating start to the season, but he has not been a panic for me whatsoever. 10 or more fantasy points every game on the year. At the time I'm recording this, he's the RB9 in fantasy. He's a solid start. Walker's a solid start. Let's move along. We got another good matchup here between the Texans and the Packers. Let's start with the Texans. Joe Mixon returned from his ankle injury that he suffered in week 2 on Sunday Night Football, and he had 27.2 fantasy points against the Patriots, 102 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 2 receptions for 30 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. We're starting Joe Mixon. He's back. He's healthy. He's a starter here. Everyone else is a sit. Cam Akers, goodbye. We're no longer having to deal with Cam Akers. Dameon Pierce, not too bad in week 6, actually. 14.7 fantasy points, 76 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 1 reception. But that was a blowout game. What they put up 41 points on the Patriots. Pierce maybe needs to be rostered over Akers. For a majority of the time when Mixon was out, Pierce was also out. He just returned here in week 6. So definitely something to keep an eye on. And then Dare Ogunbowale, who was showing some value in the receiving game, did nothing last week. 0 targets and just 2 touches on the ground for 1.8 fantasy points. So we're back to Mixon's backfield. Maybe keep an eye on Pierce. Maybe he's the handcuff to own there, but that's about it. Now, Josh Jacobs remains a weekly start. The ceiling's low. I get it. 1 touchdown on the season, but he's got to get you points. Where you drafted him, you have to start him. This offense is still very, very good. They're going to put up points, but, Jacobs' kind of role is to ease the defense away from the passing game at times. And then, there's been so many opportunities for Jacobs to have some red zone value, and the Packers just want to throw the football at Jordan Love. It's just what they do. So Jacobs is still very solid. Double-digit fantasy points every game of the year except for week 3 against Tennessee. But, yeah, the ceiling is limited. And then Emmanuel Wilson did have 8.3 fantasy points this past week. I do like Wilson, but he's still just a handcuff. We can't go out and start Emmanuel Wilson, but he's definitely a solid handcuff if you own him. So we got Jacobs, Mixon, 2 studs, start him. Everyone else in this matchup is going to be a sit. Next up, we have a divisional matchup between the Bengals and the Browns. And let's start with Chase Brown. Very, very good the last 3 weeks, 14 or more fantasy points. Zach Moss, has been dealing with that ankle injury. Did suit up in week 6, but just 13 total rushing yards off of 6 touches and 1 reception, 0.5 fantasy points. Definitely disappointing. He also had the lost fumble. So that was a big part of the fantasy stat line there. Chase Brown, like I said, those been very good. 4 touchdowns, 3 on the ground, 1 through the air in his last 3 matchups, and just looks to be the more explosive, better overall running back. So this Browns defense has been okay against the run, but I just don't care. I think the Browns defense does not scare me whatsoever. So Chase Brown, I think, is a solid start this week. And Zach Moss is still in the category. Like, I'm not going to completely, count out Zach Moss, who had, double-digit fantasy performances with a ceiling of 20 fantasy points in 3 of his first 4 starts on the season. But he is obviously a little bit banged up, and fumble last week and a big explosive touchdown run against the Giants for Chase Brown. Right now, let's play the trend and let's go with Chase Brown as a guy that we want to start. If you're desperate, Moss is probably startable. Now, Nick Chubb might make his return this week. That is the trend. That is what we are hearing out there. So, sure, if you want to fire up Nick Chubb against the Bengals run defense, I'm okay with that. They've been very poor so far on the year. And I thought Nick Chubb would take more time, especially given the state of the Browns offense, but he wants to be out there. Then let's start Nick Chubb, because Jerome Ford has looked really bad, and now he's dealing with that hamstring injury. Probably not even going to play this week. Then you got Donta Foreman, who's also pretty much just non-existent with 7 or less fantasy points so far on the year. Pierre Strong did some stuff last week, but if Chubb plays, then everyone else is going to become irrelevant. It's going to be Chubb's backfield. So it should be exciting to see Nick Chubb back. I really didn't think, once again, that he'd be back this early in the season. But if you own Chubb, I always say when players return from injury, maybe don't start them right away, but this feels like a good spot at home for the Browns. The bigger issue, I think, potentially is not the matchup here, because the matchup is good. It's not Chubb returning from injury and being, not fresh or anything. It's the Browns. It's Deshaun Watson. It's this offense. What is the upside? How often are they actually going to be scoring? How many good offensive drives are they going to put together with Watson at quarterback? That's what worries me. But if Chubb starts and plays, he's healthy, I think he is startable this week. Let's move along to the Eagles, who will travel to face the Giants. And Saquon Barkley, a little bit of a dud in week 6. 18 touches for 47 yards on the ground and 2 grabs for 7 receiving yards, 7.4 fantasy points. He's still a top 5 running back in fantasy football. He's been great. Bad week. The Eagles had a lot of success throwing the football. Wasn't a super competitive game. He'll be fine. He's going up against the Giants, his former team, for the first time. Start him this week. This Giants defense, nothing to sneeze at. But still, Saquon Barkley is Saquon Barkley. Don't panic. We're starting Barkley. And I think Saquon's going to bounce back in potentially big fashion against his former team, the New York Giants. His line on Underdog is sitting at 80.5 total rushing yards. He has hit that in every game on the season except this past week against the Browns. I would head straight over to Underdog, take the over on Barkley's rushing yards, and don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are going to get that free pick 'em for the week. Take your free pick 'em, pair it with Barkley's over on the rushing yards, and automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Now, Gainwell, Shipley, everyone else, on this roster, they're just sits. Gainwell, 3 touches last week. Shipley, I think, is still not, is he even active? I don't know, but for some reason I put his name on the screen. So it's Barkley as a start. Let's just move along. Okay. Devin Singletary, Tyrone Tracy. So we don't know the health of Devin Singletary at the time I'm recording this. He might suit back up. He missed week 6 dealing with the groin injury. And if he plays, what does that mean for Tyrone Tracy, who's been great in the absence of Devin Singletary with 14 or more fantasy points and 22.7 fantasy points in week 6? Well, I think Tracy has earned snaps even if Singletary comes back, and Tracy looks better overall than Singletary. Singletary is certainly fine through the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season up until he got hurt. So maybe not great against Dallas, but outside of that, first 3 games looked pretty good. So I think that's Tracy just offers a bit more, explosiveness. Looks better overall with the ball in his hands. A little bit better in terms of the receiving game. So, which was nice to actually see a bit more of in week 6 against the Bengals. 6 targets, 6 receptions compared to just 2 targets, 1 reception in week 5 in that first start. So Tracy was better on the ground in week 5 than he was in week 6. Better in the receiving game in week 6 than he was in week 5. But I think that this is kind of similar to like Chase Brown and Zach Moss. Like, we just kind of play the trend here because Tracy has looked really good. Obviously, if Singletary misses week 7, then we just fire up Tyrone Tracy. But for those of you who own Tracy, if Singletary returns in week 7, I still think things are going to be okay. But maybe we do want to take a step back here and see how the split looks. But we'll just have to wait and find out. I think we can definitely still potentially start both Tyrone Tracy and Devin Singletary here in week 7. All right, next up we got the Raiders traveling to face the Rams. And Alexander Mattison is sitting at 61% rostered. He's the RB23 at the time of recording this. He has double digits in every matchup except for weeks 2 and 4. He has a touchdown or double digits in every matchup except for week 4. So this is a great matchup. Going up against the Rams, this defense is awful, basically non-existent. I think he's a good start this week. We've talked a lot about Madison off and on, and he's certainly not the most attractive option, but he's a good start. And maybe the ceiling's not crazy high. He had his best fantasy performance this past week against Pittsburgh. He also had a touchdown that was called back because Justin Fields was over the line of scrimmage when he threw it. But I do like Madison this week. I think he's a good start. Now, everyone else here is Amir White dealing with a groin injury, missed week 6. Maybe White is back. I'm never starting Zamir White ever again in fantasy football. Dylan Labe lost a fumble, didn't see any other rushing attempts after that. Amir Abdullah had 2 fumbles and a lost fumble in week 6, but he saw the next most volume with 5 targets and 4 touches on the ground. I would assume with Alexander Mattison having no fumbles on the year that he's going to be the primary back here in week 7, no matter what, even if White is back or not. So sit everyone except for Alexander Mattison. When it comes to the Rams, we are starting Kyren Williams and sitting everyone else on this Rams roster. Obviously, the Rams on bye week in week 6, but Kyren is a must-start player on a weekly basis. He has at least 1 touchdown in every game on the year. He's been great. He is the heartbeat of this Rams offense right now as they continue to deal with injuries to the wide receiver position. He's a stud. Great matchup. Start Kyren, Ronnie Rivers, Blake Corum, not even fantasy relevant. Madison, Kyren Williams, 2 good starts here in week 7. Except we have the Panthers traveling to face the Washington Commanders. And Chuba Hubbard's just that guy. He's just that guy. It's a good matchup against the Commanders' run defense. He's got 11.6 or more fantasy points in 5 straight games. 15.3 in week 6, 92 yards on the ground. 5 receptions for 11 receiving yards. He gets involvement in the passing game. He's been solid on the ground with 5.1 yards per carry or more in every matchup since week 2. Chuba's that guy. It's a good matchup. Keep starting him. Miles Sanders, just not fantasy relevant. 2.3 fantasy points in week 6. Not starting him. When it comes to the Commanders, Brian Robinson Jr. missed week 6. Had the knee injury going into week 5, was able to play, but then sat out in week 6. Saw some limited touches in week 5, but still had 2 touchdowns. So if he plays against the Panthers, we're starting him. Okay? Austin Eckler was the RB1 against the Ravens, but we didn't really expect a big game because it's that Ravens run defense. But he got involvement in the passing game, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 47 receiving yards. Still saw 10 fantasy points, but not super efficient on the ground at 2.3 yards per carry. But once again, against the Ravens, hard to really, hold that against him. Sorry. Jeremy McNichols was maybe a sneaky start in week 6 with the absence of Brian Robinson Jr., but my thesis was not against the Ravens, and he had just 2 touches for 9 total yards. And Chris Rodriguez was elevated from the practice squad, but saw no touches. So this is going to come down to if Brian Robinson Jr. plays or not in week 7. If he does, he's a smash start. And even if Brian Robinson Jr. plays, Austin Eckler is still a good start because it's the Panthers. And honestly, I put Eckler in the category. He's probably a start no matter what because the Panthers are that bad. Like, literally, the Panthers are giving up touchdowns to not just the RB1s on teams, but the RB2s as well, as we've seen, at least in the last 2 weeks, off the top of my head. You've got DeAndre Swift and Roshan Johnson. You've got Bijan Robinson as well as Tyler Algier last week. So, yeah, this run defense is just literally god awful. And Eckler is probably a solid start this week. Mid-Nichols, interesting, but he's going to stay a sit. So, see what happens with Brian Robinson Jr.'s health as the week goes on, and we'll go from there. Moving along, we've got a matchup of last year's Super Bowl between the Chiefs and the Niners. Kareem Hunt, his last 2 starts as the RB1 for the Chiefs. 10 or more fantasy points. Looked very good against the Saints in week 5 with 18 fantasy points, 102 yards on the ground, and a touchdown. Chiefs on bye week last week. Listen, I think we think of this Niners offense still at times as like scary, but they have not been that good against the run. So Hunt is a solid start. Samaje Perine, sorry, I didn't put his name on the screen, but he's a sit for me. Carson Steele is going to be a sit. He's having a lot of issues with fumbling the football. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, there's some murmurs that he might return this week. He's going to be a sit for me. It just sits across the board. Looks like Kareem Hunt's going to run away with the starting job until Pacheco is back. So Hunt is a good start this week. When it comes to the Niners running backs, Jordan Mason, dealing with that AC joint sprain injury that he suffered on Thursday Night Football against the Hawks. Left the game, came back, had 1 touch, then left the game again. Not a great sign. But the good news is that typically with this injury, it's a pain management type of injury. And the Niners do have, a longer week this week because they played on Thursday Night Football. So I don't have any belief that Christian McCaffrey is going to play, by the way, this week. But I don't think his practice window is even open. So I don't think we need to worry about Christian McCaffrey before anyone says anything about that. But what do we do with Isaac Garando? So both players have an asterisk here. If Mason's the starting running back this week, we're starting Jordan Mason. If he's not the starting running back this week, I think you can play Isaac Garando, but I'm not going to go out of my way to do so. He did have 9.9 yards per carry and 99 total rushing yards, but and 9.9 fantasy points. But as many of you pointed out on the waiver wire video, he had a majority of those rushing yards on a 76-yard run and didn't look so great outside of that. So it's not a great matchup against the Chiefs running backs, but this is a good system, Kyle Shanahan system, and I'm expecting points in this game, so I think he's startable if you have nothing better, but only if Mason does not play. So should be a good matchup. We'll see what happens. Next up, we have the Jets traveling to face the Steelers, and once again, as a reminder, I have to record these early on Monday, so Monday Night Football has not been played, but I'm expecting a bounce-back game for Breece Hall against a bad Bills run defense. If he has another really bad outing, then maybe we can switch this because it's not a great matchup against the Steelers, but I think for the most part, Hall's going to bounce back in week 6 against the Bills, and I think he's going to be a solid start once again in week 7. Braylon Allen's probably going to be a sit. Now, the Bills' run defense is bad enough that maybe we get value out of both Breece Hall and Braylon Allen in week 6, which maybe changes our way of thinking here. But I'm not going to start Braylon Allen against the Steelers unless a major injury happens to Breece Hall or you're in a very deep format and you're just desperate for a couple of points. Braylon Allen is just a handcuff and he really breaks things down here on the season so far. Had some good opportunities in week 2. Then in week 3, did some things, but that's because they were blowing out the Patriots. Outside of that, he's done nothing on the season, so he's a handcuff. I think Hall will be a solid start, and for me, Hall is still a very difficult player to bench. Now, Najee Harris had a big week, his best fantasy performance of the year in week 6. After I had him as a must-start player in week 5 against the Cowboys with no Micah Parsons and DeMarcus Lawrence and an awful run defense for the Cowboys where he had 9.7 points, and then I lost faith in him. He balled out against the Raiders. had that huge touchdown run, 106 yards on the ground, 20 fantasy points. He's still in the category. You know, the Jets' run defense certainly not as good as their pass defense, but still a solid defense. And I think we had this, big game against an awful defense, awful run defense in the Raiders. I don't want to go chasing points. If you have better options than Najee Harris, just remember the floor has been very low. The ceiling has been very low as well on the year for Najee Harris. So he's definitely startable, but it just depends on what options you have. Jaylen Warren returned to action in week 6 with just 4.8 fantasy points. This is still Najee's backfield for what it's worth, and Jaylen Warren does not see a ton of involvement. So maybe that changes, but the only Steelers running back that I would consider starting going into week 7 is going to be Najee Harris. Got a great matchup between the Ravens and the Buccaneers. I'm expecting points. This should be a fun one. Derrick Henry, the RB1 in fantasy football. He has a touchdown or more in every single game on the season. 25.2 fantasy points in week 6 against Washington, 132 yards on the ground. He's having a crazy year. He's a start every single week. I don't care who he is facing. And just as a reminder, who was my favorite, most targeted, most drafted running back who I was ranting about being drafted higher all off season long? Yes, it was Derrick Henry. Okay, Justice Hill, though, I think he's in the category. I kind of always put him in this category. I don't expect a lot out of Justice Hill, but as long as there's a good game script, which I think we'll get against Tampa Bay this week, there's a potential that Justice Hill gets you 5, 10, 15 fantasy points. There's also the potential he does what he did this past week and gets you 1.4 fantasy points. There's been 2 good game scripts in a row against the Bengals and the Commanders, and he just hasn't seen that same involvement. But, in games on the season where he has 6 receptions, 6 or more targets, he has double-digit fantasy points. So, he might just be a pure handcuff to Derrick Henry, but he does have some standalone value. It's just really difficult to call when. So he's in the category, but I'm not going out of my way to start Justice Hill. But I'm expecting a good game script here, so this might be one of those weeks where he pops off. Just don't count on it. Okay, the Buccaneers backfield, the most confusing backfield in all of fantasy football right now. So Bucky Irving, great start in week 6, had a great game against the Saints, 18.5 fantasy points, 14 touches, 81 yards, a touchdown, 2 targets, 2 receptions. Tough matchup this week against the Ravens. They're at home. I like Bucky Irving this week, but I think his ceiling might be a little bit lower than it was in week 6. So I'll go ahead and say Bucky Irving, I think, is startable this week. But we go back to week 5 and Rachaad White was healthy. 9 touches to Bucky, 2 targets. 10 touches to Rachaad White, 3 targets. Week 4 when Rachaad White was healthy. 9 touches, 44 yards on the ground for Irving, 2 targets, 2 receptions. 10 touches, 49 yards on the ground for Rachaad White, 3 targets, 2 receptions. So if Rachaad White is back, I know you guys out there who hate Rachaad White are going to say, no, it doesn't matter. It does matter if Rachaad White plays. And I get that I'm a Rachaad White truther, and some of you guys hate that. And he's been bad this year, I will say that. But it does matter if Rachaad White is healthy. So it's a bad matchup as well against the Ravens. So, I'm probably not starting Rachaad White. But then we got Sean Tucker, who had 34.2 fantasy points against the Saints in week 6, 136 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 3 receptions for 56 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. And Todd Bowles has come out and said that he's played well enough in this one game to earn more opportunities. So, Todd Bowles has also said this is going to be a 3-headed monster in terms of their backfield. So, there's risk all across the board here, even with Bucky Irving. And it's not a great matchup. So I'm not expecting 20, 25, 30, 34 fantasy points out of Sean Tucker this week. And we don't even know at the time of recording this if Rachaad White's going to play this week or not, as he is dealing with that foot injury. So proceed with caution when it comes to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers running backs, especially in a bad matchup. If they were playing the Panthers or the Bills or the Raiders or the Rams, like this might be different where it's like, sure, to start them all, they'll at worst get you 7 fantasy points, or they might all score, against the Ravens. Then they get the Falcons and the Chiefs, then the Niners, and then a bye week, then the Giants, and they do get the Panthers in week 13. But for the next couple weeks, it's going to be a little bit of an interesting conundrum between these Buccaneers running backs. And I do think that we need to proceed with some caution. Last game of the week is going to be the Chargers traveling to face the Cardinals. And this is definitely an interesting one. We have a soft run defense in the Cardinals, and J.K. Dobbins showed up big time in week 6 against a good run defense and the Denver Broncos. 18.2 fantasy points, 96 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and added 2 receptions. So Dobbins and a run-first offense continues to be a solid start. He's a top 20 fantasy football running back. Like him a lot on Monday Night Football against the Cardinals. But then we saw a little emergence out of rookie running back Kamani Vidal. Didn't do a whole lot on the ground, just 4 touches for 11 rushing yards, 2.7 yards per carry, but had 2 targets, 2 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and scored a touchdown as well off of one of those receptions. So Vidal, due to the matchup, fringe start. I don't want to read a lot. You take away that 1 receiving touchdown. He did next to nothing, but it was nice to see him get involved. He has some upside. Gus Bus is on IR. Hassan Haskins, just 2 touches. Last week, he's been irrelevant all year long. So certainly a path for Kamani Vidal in his rookie season to continue to get touches in this Jim Harbaugh run-first offense. So Dobbins, a solid start. Vidal, still just if you're desperate, but could possibly come through with some points spot start this week. All right. I think this is going to be a potentially tough day for the Cardinals offense, especially if Marvin Harrison Jr. does not play. It's a tough matchup against the Chargers defense, but James Conner, is probably a player that you just start every single week. But I got him in the category because the Cardinals have looked very worrisome in the past week or so. Conner has been the bright spot next to Trey McBride and some flashes with Marvin Harrison Jr., who I still think is going to be fine. But yeah, if Marvin Harrison Jr. is out this week, I don't know how I feel about the Cardinals offense going up against the Chargers defense that's been very solid on the season all year long. So he gets the category, but if you don't have better options, then yeah, just roll with James Conner. He's still James Conner, but Mari DeMarcado saw some involvement in the passing game this past week and then had 4 touches. He had 7 total targets, 5 receptions. Trey Benson had 5 touches. So, I don't want to read too much into that, but it just feels like this offense is a little bit stale right now, and it's a bad matchup. They are at home, but it's a bad matchup against the Chargers, so just keep that in mind. Conner, probably an okay start, but maybe the upside is limited here in week 7. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single running back, every single matchup, and who you should be starting and sitting. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 7 of the season, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment, but for Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, as the week goes on, we're going to have everything that you could possibly need for week 7 of the season here on the channel. Start sits at every single position, must start defenses, kicker rankings, buy low targets, sneaky starts, players that you can't bench, fantasy Q&A, live streams, all kinds of content every single day here on the channel. So make sure that you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.